You don't realize it yet, but you're on the verge of an epic battle. You march through the wilderness with your comrades, unaware of what awaits ahead. It's raining, but not the clean rain of somewhere far away, but the warm, heavy rain of a tropical monsoon, falling so hard through the rubber trees that a man could barely make out the soldier in front of him. It was the late afternoon of the 18th of August, 1966, in a rubber plantation called Long Tan in the south of Vietnam, and a small company of Australian soldiers had just walked into the worst possible thing. Out of the gray curtain of water and the endless rows of rubber trees, an enemy force began to appear, and it did not stop appearing. There were 108 men in that company, a few of them New Zealanders. Against them, somewhere out in the rain, were around 2,500. They were not outnumbered by a little. They were outnumbered by more than 20 to 1. And then the rain grew heavier, the light began to fail, and the only things standing between that company and being wiped off the map were their own. Discipline, a wall of artillery fire, and 2 helicopters that should never have been able to fly at all. This is the Battle of Long Tan. It is the most famous thing Australian soldiers ever did in the Vietnam War. The action their country still stops to remember every single year. And the strange thing is how close it came to being a massacre instead of a legend. Over the next few minutes, you are going to understand how barely 100 men survived a force more than 20 times their size, why the monsoon that should have doomed them may help save them, and how the whole thing nearly ended not on the battlefield but decades later, in a quiet fight for recognition that took one man almost his entire life. But to understand any of it, you have to start with how they ended up out there in the first place, because nobody expected a battle at all. In the middle of 1966, the Australian task force had set up its base at a place called Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province, a stretch of country that the Viet Cong had effectively owned for years. The Australians were the newcomers, and both sides were still taking each other's measure. The night before the battle, the base had been hit by enemy mortars and recoilless rifle fire, and the next day patrols were sent out to find where that fire had come from. One of them was Delta Company of the 6th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, led by Major Harry Smith. 108 men, including a small party of New Zealand artillery observers attached to them, moving out into the rubber plantation on what was meant to be a routine follow-up. Find the firing point, report it, come home. It was the kind of task that happens hundreds of times in a war without anyone remembering it. What the Australians did not know, and what the intelligence had badly underestimated, was that they were not walking toward a few mortar crews. They were walking toward a force of around 2,500 men, a Viet Cong regiment, reinforced with North Vietnamese regulars, and a local main force battalion either moving into position to attack Nui Dat directly or already waiting in the plantation. And so, in the gray light of a wet afternoon, one of Delta Company's platoons made contact. Not a skirmish, not a few snipers. A wall of fire that came out of the rubber trees and did not let up. Within minutes, it was obvious to everyone that this was something else entirely. The routine patrol had walked into the middle of an army. It fell hardest at first on a single forward platoon. Pushed out ahead of the rest of the company, those men took the full weight of the opening assault, and within minutes they were fighting for their lives, taking casualties, nearly surrounded, calling back through failing radios that they were in heavy contact and could not move. For a while it looked as though that platoon would simply be swallowed whole, cut off in the rain and destroyed before anyone could reach it. Behind them, Major Smith pulled the rest of Delta Company into a tight defensive position among the rubber trees and made the only decision that gave any of them a chance. They would not run, because running in the open against that many men was simply a slower way to die. They would hold where they stood, dig in, and trust that firepower could do what their numbers never could. And now we have to talk about the rain, because the rain is the thing that makes Long Tan unlike any other last stand of the war, and you cannot understand the battle without it. When the monsoon broke over the plantation, it came down in a way that is hard to picture if you've never stood in it. A solid, drumming downpour that turned the red earth into ankle-deep mud and the air itself into a gray haze. Visibility collapsed to a few meters. The neat rows of rubber trees, which in the dry would have offered clean lanes of fire, became corridors of shifting shadow where a man could not tell a tree trunk from a crouching enemy until he was almost on top of him. The noise of the rain swallowed the noise of movement. Radios crackled and faded. The wounded lay in water. Every man in that company was soaked to the skin within minutes and stayed that way for hours, fighting in mud that sucked at their boots and rain that ran down their faces and into their eyes as they tried to find targets in the murk, magazines and weapons clogged with red mud. Men shouted to be heard over the downpour and the gunfire, and half the time were not heard at all. It was less like a battle as we tend to picture them, with clear lines and visible enemies, and more like a brawl fought half-blind, in slow motion, almost underwater. You would think all of that worked against the Australians, and in many ways it did. But here is the twist that the storm hid inside it. The same rain and the same failing light that blinded Delta Company also blinded the enemy. A force of 2,500 men trying to coordinate a massed assault needs to see, needs to mass, needs to find the precise edges of the small unit it is trying to surround and crush. The monsoon took that away from them too. It turned what should have been a quick, overwhelming envelopment into a confused, groping fight in which the enemy's huge numerical advantage could never quite be brought to bear all at once. The storm that tormented the defenders also smeared the attackers, and in that smear, 100 men found just enough room to survive. Hold on to that idea, because the weather is going to come back as a problem at the worst possible moment. For now, picture Delta Company's situation as the afternoon wore on. The platoons had become separated in the rain and the trees, some of them nearly cut off, fighting their own desperate little battles in the murk. Casualties were mounting, and the one resource that decides every fight like this, ammunition, was running down with frightening speed. A soldier in a sustained firefight burns through what he carries faster than anyone who has not done it can imagine, and these men had been fighting for over an hour with no resupply, in a downpour, surrounded. In most versions of this story, this is the point where the unit is overrun. The arithmetic simply does not allow 100 men to keep this up against thousands. Except Delta Company had two things the enemy had not fully accounted for. The first was the artillery. A few kilometers away, back at Nui Dat, the guns of the supporting field regiment had opened fire, and they did not stop for hours. Australian, New Zealand, and American guns, firing in the rain, dropping shell after shell into the plantation around Delta Company's positions. And this is the part that matters, so I am not going to reduce it to numbers. The forward observers with the company, including those New Zealanders, were calling the artillery in so close to their own men that it was landing almost on top of them. A moving curtain of high explosive walked back and forth across the advancing enemy, sometimes only meters in front of the Australian line. It was dangerous, terrifyingly so. A small error in the rain would have killed the very men it was meant to protect. But it was also the only thing in the world keeping the enemy from simply walking over them with weight of numbers. Every time the Viet Cong massed for another push through the trees, the shells came down and tore the assault apart before it could land. The artillery was not support, it was the wall. It was the only reason there was still a Delta Company by nightfall. But a wall of shells does not solve the ammunition problem inside the perimeter. By around 6 in the evening, the men of Delta Company were scraping the bottom. Rifles going quiet, not because the enemy had stopped, but because there was almost nothing left to fire. And this is where the storm came back as the enemy, because the obvious answer, fly in more ammunition, was very nearly impossible. You do not casually fly a helicopter low over a raging battle in a monsoon with visibility down to almost nothing, to hover above men who are nearly surrounded. It is the kind of flight that gets aircraft shot out of the sky or flown straight into the trees. And yet that is exactly what 2 Iroquois helicopters of the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 9 Squadron did. They flew out into the storm, found the company in the gloom, and dropped crates of ammunition wrapped in blankets down through the rain to the men below, who tore them open and got back into the fight. It is one of the legendary moments of the whole battle, and rightly so. 2 crews chose to fly into the worst of it in the worst possible day, because men on the ground were going to die without them. I am going to stop here for one moment, because what happened next decided everything, and these are exactly the kind of men this channel exists to remember. If 108 soldiers standing against 2,500 in a monsoon is a story you think more people should know, then stop right now and subscribe and leave the words "Long10" in the comments. Battles fought by other people's allies get forgotten first, and the only thing that keeps them from disappearing is whether you tell the algorithm they matter. It costs you 1 tap. Do it now, because the rescue is about to arrive, and it does not come the way you would expect. By the time the light was almost gone, Delta Company had been fighting for hours and was hanging on by its fingertips. What broke the battle open was not more infantry on foot, it was armor. Back at Nui Dat, a relief force from Alpha Company had loaded into M113 armored personnel carriers, and those vehicles came smashing through the plantation in the last of the daylight, machine guns firing, crashing out of the rain and into the flank of the enemy assault. For the Viet Cong commanders, this was the nightmare scenario. Their formations were in the open, committed to crushing a company they thought was finished, and suddenly armored vehicles were tearing into them from a direction they had not prepared for. The assault that had been minutes from overrunning Delta Company broke apart. The enemy began to pull back into the dark and the rain, dragging their wounded with them, and just like that, the longest afternoon those Australians would ever live was over. What none of them could quite believe, in the quiet that followed, was that they were still alive to feel the rain. The plantation that had been full of muzzle flashes and shell fire and screaming a few minutes before was suddenly just a wet, dark wood again. When the survivors and the relief force swept the plantation the next morning, the scale of what had happened became clear. Delta Company had lost 18 men killed and had 24 wounded. 42 casualties, more than a third of the entire company, gone in a single afternoon. But out in the rubber trees, more than 200 enemy bodies were counted, and the trails of blood dragging away into the jungle told of many, many more who had been carried off. 108 men, soaked, exhausted, nearly out of ammunition, had held against thousands, and they had held. And then something happened that tells you everything about how wars are remembered. And it is a beat that most tellings of this battle leave out. On the other side, Radio Hanoi announced a great victory. The broadcast claimed that the Viet Cong had won a crushing triumph at Long Tan, that hundreds of Australians had been killed, that around 700 lay dead, and that 2 squadrons of Australian tanks had been destroyed. There was just one problem with that last detail. The Australians did not have a single tank in the entire country. The propaganda had invented an enemy force that did not exist and destroyed it gloriously, for an audience that would never be able to check. It is a small, almost absurd detail, but it is also a perfect illustration of the gap between what happened and what each side needed people to believe had happened. The truth was 108 men in the mud. The story broadcast to the world was a fantasy with tanks in it. The truth, though, is the part worth sitting with, and it is darker and more human than any propaganda. Many of the men of Delta Company were not career soldiers. They were national servicemen, young Australians conscripted into the army, ordinary citizens in uniform who had not chosen Vietnam, some of them barely out of their teens. Boys who a year or two earlier had been working ordinary jobs in ordinary Australian towns, and who had been handed a rifle and a number and sent to the other side of the world. They were the ones who stood in that plantation and did not break. And in the years that followed, the men who survived Long Tan ran into a different kind of enemy, a bureaucratic one. Their commander, Harry Smith, came to believe that his soldiers had never been properly recognized for what they did that day, that the awards and decorations they earned had been downgraded, watered down, lost in the machinery of how medals get handed out. And so he spent decades, literally the rest of his working life and beyond, fighting to get his men the recognition he was certain they had earned. It became a campaign that outlasted the war by generations, an old soldier refusing to let the country forget what 100 young men had done in the rain. That is the real legacy of Long Tan. Not just the battle, but the long fight to make sure it counted. Today, a simple cross stands in memory of the men who died there, the Long Tan Cross, and it now rests in the Australian War Memorial, one of the most quietly powerful objects in the building. And every year, on the 18th of August, Australia marks Vietnam Veterans Day on the anniversary of this battle. Because of all the things its soldiers did in that war, this is the one the nation chose to carry forward. Not a grand strategic victory. A single afternoon when barely 100 men, many of them conscripts who never asked to be there, stood in a monsoon against an army and did not run. And here is the thing about that kind of courage. It was not unique to one company on one afternoon. It ran through the whole Australian war, and now and then it concentrated itself into a single man. 3 years after Long Tan, in another corner of this same conflict, one Australian would find himself alone in the dark, surrounded, with wounded men scattered around him and every reason in the world to save himself. What he chose to do instead is almost impossible to believe, and it would earn him the highest decoration his country could give. If the stand at Long Tan showed you what 100 Australians could do together, wait until you see what one of them did alone. That is the story we are telling next.